At 6:01 a.m., Nora Lee, widowed, 63, wearing a nightgown and fuzzy slippers, watched through a pair of scratched binoculars as three men in tactical gear crept along her fence line. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a honey-gold glow over the dew-covered fields. The men didn't belong there. Their jackets said HOA security, but their boots said private contractors, and the way they held their rifles was no neighborhood patrol posture. Nora didn't panic. She didn't even blink. By 6:05, they were whispering into radios and pointing toward her house. By 6:07, one of them raised his gun and motioned for the others to advance. By 6:10, the front man stepped on something buried just beneath the wild grass. A sharp click rang out. He froze. His knees locked. His eyes widened in a panic. The others stopped mid-step, trying not to breathe. Inside the house, Nora turned the crank on her old radio transmitter, the one she'd kept from her military days, and leaned toward the mic. Her voice crackled through the hidden speaker buried in the bushes. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She just said calmly, "Tell your boss the simple woman just declared war. One more step, and y'all lose your kneecap." The man on the pressure plate didn't move. The other two turned in slow motion, as if afraid any sudden movement might set something else off. Nora turned off the radio and poured herself a cup of coffee. Hazelnut. 2 creams. She took it out onto the porch and sat in her rocking chair, watching them squirm from a distance like bugs on a hot skillet. 3 days ago, this land had been quiet. The hens clucked peacefully. Her old blue heeler, Scout, would bark at squirrels and then collapse in the sun like he'd just won a war. That was before the letter. The letter had arrived in a pristine white envelope with the HOA logo embossed in gold. It claimed that due to a recent zoning adjustment, Nora's property had been designated for community development use. The HOA now had jurisdiction. It said she could either agree to sell for market value or face legal action. No signature. No contact name. Just a deadline. She'd chuckled. She wasn't even part of the HOA. She lived outside their borders, half a mile past their subdivision gate. She had never paid dues, never signed up, never attended their ridiculous wine and code enforcement meetings. The only reason they even cared now was because the land beneath her house had become valuable. Too valuable. The next day, her mailbox had been tampered with. Her electricity blinked off at odd hours. Then came the noise, hovering drones that buzzed past her windows late at night. At first, she thought it was kids playing around. But then she found a small device mounted under her eave. A camera. It was connected to a battery and a small transmitter. Someone had bugged her house. And then, yesterday afternoon, the mailman, Jesse, handed her the newspaper with a worried expression. He leaned in and whispered, "You didn't hear this from me, but I saw a requisition form go through HOA channels. They hired a private group. Said you were a threat to community order." He looked like he wanted to say more, but someone drove by and he straightened up and walked away fast. Nora had watched him go, heart thudding but face expressionless. She hadn't been called a threat since she left the service. In those days, she wore a uniform, carried classified tools, and defused bombs across seas for a flag that sometimes forgot her name. When she came home, all she wanted was peace. A little house, some chickens, a garden, and a rocking chair with a porch view. She'd paid for this land fair and square. It was hers. And now the same types of people who had laughed when she came home in a faded uniform were trying to take it with paperwork and thugs. But they had made one fatal error. They thought she was just a simple woman. Nora stepped back inside, opened the shed behind her kitchen, and pulled down the old footlocker. It was heavy. Inside were items from a different life. Field manuals, coils of wire, dummy grenades for training, signal flares, a small stack of claymore casings with the insides hollowed out. She didn't intend to hurt anyone, but she could sure as hell scare them. She had spent decades building things that looked dangerous enough to turn trained men into jelly. And if the HOA wanted a war of nerves, she'd give them one. By the end of that afternoon, She had turned her property line into a Hollywood war zone. Buried pressure plates connected to smoke bombs. Lines strung to trip flares. Decoys made from scrap metal and duct tape. From above, the place looked innocent. From ground level, it looked like a bad memory. And the best part was, she recorded it all. With cameras of her own. At 6:20 a.m., the man on the pressure plate finally found the courage to call someone on his radio. Nora listened in from the porch with a smirk. He said, "We got a situation." She rigged the yard. "Looks like trap. I think she's ex-military." Not what we were told. Not what they were told. That part made her laugh. They were probably told she was old, isolated, and half senile. They probably thought she'd be scared into packing up and leaving. But she wasn't scared. She was boiling. They had threatened her home, her peace, her dog, her chickens, and they'd done it with smug faces and forged authority. Scout barked suddenly from the back porch. Nora stood. She could see more figures approaching from the ridge. 2 more. These ones weren't in uniform. Civilians. Maybe HOA board members. Maybe just curious residents from the subdivision. Either way, they were walking straight into her perimeter. Nora picked up the radio again and pressed the mic. "I wouldn't go much further if I were you. One of those bushes has teeth." They froze. Nora sipped her coffee. From here on out, they'd know she wasn't just some frail old woman guarding a pile of dirt. She was the wrong person to push. She didn't go looking for war, but if one showed up in her yard, she'd fight it with the tools she had. And lucky for her, she had more tools than anyone knew. The front man on the pressure plate shifted his weight back carefully, his arms raised in surrender. "Good," she said quietly, watching him retreat. "Now run home and tell your boss." The simple woman just got complicated. Nora didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, but because her brain was humming with purpose. She hadn't felt that kind of focus since her active duty days. The traps had worked, the message was sent, but she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first move on the board. HOA thugs didn't retreat out of fear. They went back to regroup. And Nora had a feeling that Karen Wexler, president of the HOA, wasn't used to being embarrassed. That woman wore power like perfume. Loud, suffocating, and cheap. Nora opened her laptop and logged into a server that hadn't been touched in over a decade. It was dusty digital territory, full of old files, coded messages, and secure logs. One particular folder was labeled Oil Field South Quadrant 2. She clicked it open and stared at a scanned document. Mineral rights, signed in 1989. Her husband had filed it after discovering a survey map that showed a crude pipeline projected to cross their southern pasture. It had been a nothing burger then. Just ink on paper. But now? Now it was the whole pie. She poured another cup of coffee and scrolled through emails. 3 from neighbors. One was sympathetic. One asked if she was okay. The third was from Marcy Dunn, a nosy woman who lived 2 streets over, telling Nora she should be ashamed for staging fake explosions and disturbing the community. Nora laughed and deleted it. Marcy hadn't even offered pie the entire year. By dawn, Nora had formed a plan. If they wanted her land, she'd make sure everyone knew exactly why. They weren't after her fence line. They were after what lay beneath it. She needed confirmation. Something solid. She pulled out her phone and called the only person she trusted who still dealt with property law. Big Mike. Big Mike was 6'4", weighed nearly 300 pounds, and wore cowboy boots to court. He also used to date Nora's niece, which made him eternally obligated to answer her calls, even if things between him and the niece had gone sour. Mike picked up on the 3rd ring and groaned, "You calling me before breakfast must mean there's a body or a lawsuit." "Not a body yet," Nora said. "But I've got a contract here that's about to ruin a few HOA sleep schedules." She explained everything. The pipeline, the thugs, the traps, the letter, the mineral rights. Mike whistled low. "That pipeline's back in play?" he asked. "I thought they shelved it years ago." "Apparently they dug it up. And now they want to run it straight through my land." Mike asked her to send him the documents. She did. Less than an hour later, he called back, voice tight with excitement. Nora, I don't think you understand what you're sitting on. That lease doesn't just give you mineral rights, it gives you exclusive extraction control. If they're already moving oil through that pipe without your consent, they're not just trespassing, they're stealing. Nora blinked. Say that again. They're stealing from you. Every barrel that passes through that stretch is technically yours unless they cut you in. That explained everything. Why the HOA suddenly cared. Why they were trying to push her off the land. They weren't just protecting their silly codes and lawns. They were helping a private energy firm quietly siphon oil and profit. Later that morning, Nora drove into town to speak to the vet. Not for Scout, he was fine, but because Doc Hannah knew everything that happened in the area. She was the kind of person who noticed if a squirrel twitched weirdly near a fence. Sure enough, Doc Hannah already knew. You see the fire down near the Peterson place? She asked as she checked Scout's ears. Just last week. Fence lit up out of nowhere. Then the HOA told them their land was condemned for safety. Let me guess, Nora said. The Petersons sold and moved out. Moved out and got pennies. Doc's voice turned dark. They were scared. Dogs poisoned. Their kids followed home from school. They thought it was neighbors being nasty. But I knew. You knew it was HOA. They don't just want order, Hannah said. They want control. And some of them, especially Karen, want money. You've seen her new truck? Fully loaded. And she ain't got no job besides that board. It all made a sick kind of sense. Karen had been setting this up for months, maybe years. Slowly scaring off landowners near Nora's property. Faking violations. Sabotaging utilities. Until one by one, they gave up and sold. Nora was the last piece. Nora left the vet's office and stopped by the diner for lunch. It was packed with town folk, gossip rising off the tables like steam. As she walked in, conversation paused. Then someone clapped. Another nodded. A few gave her thumbs up. Apparently, word of the pressure plate incident had traveled fast. She sat at the counter. Marlene, the waitress, leaned in and whispered, "My cousin in code enforcement said Karen's losing it. Said you made her look like a fool in front of the whole board. You better be careful though. She doesn't like losing." Nora just smiled. "I don't like being stolen from. Guess we're both gonna have a rough week." Back at home, Nora installed more fake traps, swapped out batteries in her cameras, and added a new sign to her gate. It read, "This land protected by booby traps and boredom. Trespassers will be shamed online." That evening, a black SUV drove by slowly, windows tinted. It didn't stop. But she could feel eyes on her. Watching. Calculating. She made a deliberate show of holding her binoculars up to her face and waving. She spent the rest of the night assembling copies of her mineral rights lease, security footage, and HOA correspondence. She was ready for war, but not the kind with bullets. This time, it would be fought in courtrooms, online forums, and media outlet. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, she'd play smart. And if anyone else tried to sneak onto her land again, they'd be greeted by one of her new scarecrow dummies, which now came complete with blinking LED eyes and motion-triggered growls recorded by her neighbor's pitbull. As the sky darkened and cicadas buzzed through the night air, Nora sat on her porch with Scout at her feet. She didn't feel old. She didn't feel tired. She felt dangerous. She looked out across her field and whispered, "Let them come. I've got more surprises than they got bad intentions. And I've been underestimated longer than they've been alive." She raised her coffee mug to the darkness and grinned. To round two. The next morning, the wind carried a scent Nora hadn't smelled in years. Burnt ozone and hot copper. The kind of smell that came from cheap surveillance drones and fried wires. She squinted up at the sky and spotted it. One of those high-res HOA drones zipping around like an oversized mosquito. Only this one had an upgraded lens and a stabilized gimbal, probably the kind meant for industrial inspections, not neighborhood violations. They were getting serious now. Nora didn't panic. She walked straight out to the field and stared at it, hands on her hips, sun in her eyes. She could almost hear the operator somewhere in a suburban garage, squirming at her unbothered glare. She raised a single hand and gave the drone a slow, sarcastic wave. Then she turned her back and walked inside, giving them exactly what they hated most: no fear. Inside, she opened the drawer next to her sink and pulled out a small device that looked like a car remote. It was something she'd rigged years ago for fun, a simple jammer she used when she wanted to nap without being buzzed by tourists' gadget. She flipped the switch. In less than 10 seconds, the drone started stuttering midair, dipped once, then lost control and spiraled into the creek like a mechanical duck shot out of the sky. Scout barked twice, tail wagging, like he knew she'd just won something. Nora leaned over and gave him a scratch behind the ears. "That's one down, old boy. Probably got a dozen more behind it." After breakfast, Nora called Big Mike again. His voice came in excited this time. He had news. "Nora, they're already drilling. The pipeline company never filed the revised environmental impact statement. I checked public records. They're operating illegally across multiple zones, and your land is their midpoint. If we file the right injunctions, we can shut them down. Temporarily, at least." Temporarily wasn't enough. Nora wanted it all. The pipeline stopped, the land protected, and Karen's entire HOA empire turned to rubble. But she was willing to play the long game. Big Mike explained how they'd need to document everything. Prove malicious intent. Show a pattern. Nora told him she was already ahead of him. She had security footage, the HOA letters, timestamps, even the footage from the guy stepping on the pressure plate. What she needed now was something that proved beyond doubt that the HOA and the pipeline company were working together off the books. Mike paused on the other end. "That's the hard part. Unless someone inside talked." Nora didn't say anything at first. Then she asked, "You remember Karen's assistant? That girl, Alana? Always looked nervous, like she hated where she worked?" Mike chuckled. "Yeah. Quiet thing. Always holding a clipboard like it was a shield." Nora narrowed her eyes. "I think she might be our crack in the dam." That afternoon, she drove to the HOA office under the pretense of collecting forms. Alana was at the front desk, eyes darting like she was being watched. Nora handed her a folded piece of paper with nothing but an address and a time. She didn't say a word. Alana glanced at it, then at Nora, then gave the tiniest nod. At exactly 7 p.m., a beige sedan pulled up behind Nora's barn. Alana stepped out, hood pulled low, and made her way around the back where Nora was waiting. The girl looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I don't have long," Alana whispered. "If Karen finds out." "She won't." "Sit." Nora poured them both tea and slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of the drone, the burned camera, and screen grabs of Karen attending private meetings with someone from the energy company. "I need proof," Nora said gently. "Emails. Memos. Anything that shows she was coordinating with them to push people off their land." Alana hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me." "What's on it?" "Everything. Meeting notes, payment logs, even the fake violation forms. They've been targeting landowners for over a year. I tried to tell someone, but Karen made it clear. I'd lose everything if I spoke up." "Not anymore," Nora said. "You did the right thing. You just gave a whole town its spine back." Later that night, Nora sat in her living room, drive plugged into her laptop, watching as document after document confirmed her suspicions. HOA board minutes redacted from public view. Private invoices sent to an unlisted subcontractor. Payments for security enforcement. She had dates, times, names. Even a recorded Zoom call where Karen laughed and said, "By the time she figures it out, that land'll be community parkland or an oil station. Either way, she won't be there to see it." Nora sat back, hands trembling not from fear but from the electric charge of justice finally forming shape. She copied the files to 3 different drives, one for Big Mike, one for the media, and one for herself. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over 10 years. The voice on the other end answered with a gravelly tone. Nora? You still alive? More than ever, Frank, she replied. You still got friends at the local paper? Frank was an old friend from her protest days, back when she used to stand at the front of town meetings and argue about things like surveillance ordinances and land zoning. He was a retired journalist now, but he still had connections. You got something juicy? She smiled. Let's just say HOA Karen's about to go viral. The next day, the headline ran bold across every news feed in the county. Local HOA linked to illegal land grab scheme. Subheadline: Military veteran fights back with receipt. Nora didn't hide. She put on her cleanest boots, brushed out her hair, and stood on her porch while the local news team filmed her in front of her pressure plate garden. She told them about the pipeline, the bullying, the drones, and the fake fines. She spoke clearly and calmly, never raising her voice. She didn't need to. By noon, her phone was ringing nonstop. Neighbors who once avoided her now asked how they could help. A retired engineer offered to help fortify her fences. A local baker dropped off pie. And Big Mike called with even better news. They blinked, Nora. The HOA just pulled their lawsuit against you. Karen's gone silent. You hit them harder than they ever expected. Nora grinned. Oh, we're just getting started. Because she knew that once power was threatened, it always clawed back. They'd try again. Maybe sneakier this time. But now, she wasn't alone. Now the town was watching. And if Karen or anyone else thought this old woman was going to back down, they were in for one hell of a surprise. She patted Scout, looked over her field, and said, "That was check. Let's play for checkmate." The sun had barely crested the hills when Nora woke to the distant sound of metal clanking. Not birds. Not wind. Not even coyotes this time. This was mechanical. Heavy. Deliberate. She stepped onto her porch, wrapped in her old flannel robe, Scout trailing behind her with a low growl. At first, she didn't see anything unusual. The field was empty. The fence was untouched. But then she spotted it. A large steel shipping container had been dropped off at the edge of her land during the night. No tire tracks. No delivery notice. No one had knocked. It just appeared. She grabbed her binoculars. A number stenciled on the side, barely visible in the morning haze, read ComCon 11. Below it, in smaller letters, Private Site Storage. Authorized entry only. Nora's jaw tightened. She didn't authorize anything. She didn't touch the container. Not right away. That was the mistake they wanted her to make: open it, inspect it, react. Instead, she set up 3 trail cameras aimed at the box and waited. By mid-morning, a black pickup truck parked on the road just beyond the county line. 2 men got out and stared at the container through binoculars. One of them, she recognized from the drone footage. The one who stepped on the pressure plate. She sent a message to Big Mike and attached the new photos. He called back in minute. That box? It's a mobile command post. Probably rented by the energy company under an alias. They're not just watching you now. They're coordinating something bigger. Coordinated meant planned. Planned meant escalation. Nora knew they weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were setting the stage for something more aggressive. She needed to get ahead of it. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the mayor. A decent man, but spineless. The kind who gave long speeches about fairness but never raised his voice unless the coffee machine broke. His office was quiet when she walked in, and the secretary gave her a nervous smile like she wasn't sure if Nora was there to talk or burn the place down. Mayor Rick leaned back in his chair when he saw her. "Nora, to what do I owe the visit?" She dropped a manila folder on his desk. Inside were stills from the drone footage, the video of the armed men trespassing, and a printed email from the flash drive with Karen's name attached to a payment memo from the pipeline company. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through. "Proof," she said. "Proof that your HOA president is working with private contractors to force me and my neighbors off our land. Proof that they've weaponized fake violations and intimidation. And if you don't make a public statement by morning, this will go straight to the state attorney's office. With your name in it." He turned pale. Nora didn't wait for his excuse. She just stood, nodded, and walked out. That night, the local news broadcast featured a sudden change of heart from the mayor. He announced a temporary suspension of all HOA enforcement activities pending an investigation. It was a small victory, but Nora wasn't fooled. It wouldn't stop Karen. It would only slow her down. Sure enough, by midnight, the field cameras picked up movement. 3 silhouettes approached the container, opened it, and rolled out something long and bulky, some kind of surveying machine. They began scanning the land directly adjacent to Nora's southern property line. They were mapping underground assets, looking for pipeline access. But they were about to get a very different surprise. You see, while the rest of the town slept, Nora had been busy. With the help of her new neighbor, Isaac, retired electrical engineer and conspiracy theorist turned ally, they'd rigged a series of decoy conduits, fake manhole covers, and planted dozens of false data points that mimicked pipeline signals. Anyone using a scanner would pick them up, sure. But none of them were real. It was a landmine of lies. Isaac called her that night, laughing so hard he could barely speak. They just flagged a decoy junction as a critical pipeline tap. They're marking it as their next drill point. "Nora, you're gonna love this. We filled that conduit with foam insulation and glitter bombs." Nora laughed too. It felt good after so many days of tension. But it didn't mean she let her guard down. The next morning, she received a certified letter. Another HOA violation. This one more aggressive than any before. It accused her of creating dangerous terrain that threatened the integrity of adjacent community infrastructure. They'd attached a $75,000 fine. $75,000. For booby traps and fake wires on her own land. Scout barked as if he knew it was garbage. Nora opened the front gate and hung the letter up like a trophy, right next to her wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be mocked publicly." But something changed that day. She noticed it in the air. In the way the birds stopped chirping. In how 2 strangers in khakis parked near her fence and just watched without getting out of the car. Something bigger was coming. At sunset, Isaac showed up with news. "We got access to one of their internal comms channels. Just chatter, nothing fancy. But I heard a name. Operation Clearfield. And a date. Tomorrow night." Nora's smile faded. Operation Clearfield wasn't a survey. It was a sweep. A takeover. They were planning to send in more men. Maybe armed. Maybe worse. It was time to end this. She called Big Mike and told him to prepare the emergency injunction. She contacted Frank at the paper and sent over every last bit of evidence. Then she sat down, opened her old footlocker one final time, and pulled out the last tool she had never used. Not in the wars, not in training. A handmade radio-triggered flare system designed to simulate incoming fire. Terrifying, legal, and completely safe if you knew where to stand. The field was quiet as the sun dipped low. Nora stood near the porch, wind in her hair, and waited. Tomorrow they'd come again. But this time they'd leave changed. Because if Karen thought she could erase a life with fines and fear, she was about to learn what a real line in the sand looked like. And this time it was wired. The air was thick with tension the next evening, the kind you could feel humming in your teeth. Nora had barely slept the night before, her mind turning like a turbine. Every rustle outside had her hand twitching near the radio switch. Every flicker of light made her heart thud with anticipation. She had seen combat, face-down bombs with less adrenaline than she felt now. Because this wasn't a battlefield. This was her porch, her dog, her land, and tonight it would either stand or fall. The sun sank lower behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the property. The fake conduits still glittered from Isaac's glitter bomb prank the night before, and the scorched drone lay half-submerged in the creek like a broken toy. Nothing moved. But the silence didn't comfort Nora. It was too intentional, too perfect. Scout gave a low growl at 8:41 p.m. Right on time. Nora stepped out onto the porch, her fingers hovering over the switch for the flare rig she'd buried near the south pasture. Through her binoculars, she spotted them. 6 figures, all in black, no HOA vests this time. No IDs. Just boots, radios, and rifles with mounted lights. They were walking low, 2 by 2, heading straight for the fake pipeline junction. Isaac's voice crackled through the walkie she had clipped to her belt. "They're in the zone. You ready?" "Born ready," Nora muttered. She let them get close. Too close. 20 feet from the decoy valve. One even reached down with a gloved hand to scan the conduit. Then she hit the switch. A flare shot out of the grass with a violent hiss, shrieking into the air before bursting into a blinding white flash. The men dropped instantly, scrambling for cover. Another flare fired. Then another. Then the screamers triggered, pre-recorded war zone sound effects Nora had engineered from old footage layered with Isaac's homemade edits. Yelling, sirens, the sound of incoming fire. The men panicked. One yelled into his radio, "They've got live munitions." Repeat, ambush. They weren't just confused. They were terrified. None of them had expected this kind of resistance. This wasn't an old woman with a legal case. This was psychological warfare, and they weren't trained for it. But Nora wasn't done. As they retreated toward the tree line, 2 of them tripped tripwires that triggered compressed air mines. Harmless, but loud enough to send one of the men running into a ditch face first. Another slipped on the slick grass she'd watered down hours earlier. She could have written a comedy script from the chaos. She switched channels on the walkie. "Isaac, the cameras? Live. We're streaming to 3 groups, plus Frank's got a direct line." Good. The world was going to see it all. Unauthorized private security invading private property, armed, in the dark, attacking a woman with no legal reason to be targeted. Nora didn't even need to say a word on camera. The footage said everything. Back in town, Big Mike was already filing the emergency injunction. By morning, the court would be flooded with visual evidence and legal argument. But even as she won the legal war, Nora knew Karen wasn't finished. At 10:17 p.m., Nora's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You won't keep it. It belongs to the community now." Nora stared at the message. The phrasing. The arrogance. The assumption that because something was profitable, it could be taken. She didn't reply. Instead, she copied the number and sent it to Big Mike, who responded seconds later with, "Belongs to Karen's burner. We're adding it to the pile." The next morning, the story went national. Armed contractors invade widow's property over secret oil pipeline. The footage of the flares, the screams, the ridiculous chaos of grown men running from garden lights and booby traps, it went viral within hours. By noon, national news vans were parked a mile down the road. Reporters begged for interviews. Nora declined every single one. She'd said what needed saying with her actions. Her dignity stayed on the porch with her coffee cup. But not everyone stayed quiet. Alana, the assistant who'd slipped Nora the flash drive, stepped forward with a public statement. She admitted to years of internal misconduct within the HOA, showed logs of backdoor deals, and even released Karen's meeting minutes where she discussed paying off the sheriff to ignore the nightly raid. That was the nail in the coffin. By 4 p.m., 2 unmarked black cars pulled up to the HOA headquarters. Men in dark suits walked in. Karen was escorted out in handcuffs less than 20 minutes later. The local sheriff was gone by nightfall too, resigned, they said. Disgraced was more accurate. Big Mike called Nora that evening, giddy as a schoolboy. "You just burned down an empire with fireworks and fake wires," he said. "I've never seen anything like it." Nora didn't laugh. She was too tired, too relieved. But she did smile. A long, quiet smile. The best part? The court not only ruled in her favor, but granted her the right to charge back payment fees for every barrel that passed under her land for the last 4 months. It wasn't just compensation, it was ownership. It was justice. And it wasn't over. Later that week, Nora met with an independent energy consultant, someone Isaac had vetted, to negotiate a lease on her terms. She wouldn't allow reckless drilling, and she wouldn't allow anyone to build near her home. But the consultant offered her something different. A revenue-sharing deal, clean extraction, land protections, and oversight. For once, someone came to her with respect. She accepted. That night, Nora sat on her porch, watching the stars come out one by one. Scout was asleep at her feet. The wind was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't dangerous anymore. The kind that felt earned. She looked out across her field and whispered, "They thought I'd sell. They thought I'd run. They forgot who they were dealing with." And tomorrow, she planned to install a new sign right beneath her old wooden one. Not to threaten. Not to mock. Just a quiet message. "This land is mine. And I'm never leaving." You said. 2 weeks later, Nora stood in the same spot where it all began. On her porch, in her favorite flannel robe, steaming coffee in one hand and Scout lying at her feet. The morning was peaceful, almost suspiciously so, as if the wind itself knew not to stir too loudly around her ranch anymore. The chaos had ended, but the aftershocks still rippled through town like distant thunder. HOA flags were coming down, lawn enforcement notices were vanishing from mailboxes, and Karen Wexler's name had become an unspoken curse. People didn't say her name anymore. They just shook their heads and whispered things like, "That's what happens when you mess with the wrong woman." But it wasn't just about Nora. The town had changed too. The community, once divided into HOA loyalists and outsiders, now leaned heavily in Nora's favor. The footage of the Flair ambush had gone viral not just because it was dramatic, but because it was poetic. A supposed frail widow defending her land with her own tools, outwitting armed men, and dismantling a corrupt board without ever firing a single bullet. She had become a symbol, not of violence, but of standing ground when everything else told you to step back. She wasn't just a woman on a ranch anymore. She was the story. But the part most people didn't know, and might never fully understand, was how carefully she had layered the war. How each scarecrow was placed with intention. How each flare, each tripwire, each decoy pipeline had been orchestrated with such patience it nearly drove her mad. There were nights she sat awake, running simulations in her head, calculating angles and light exposure, wondering if it would all be enough. She hadn't relied on strength. She had relied on planning, on persistence, on knowing that when power comes knocking, the only way to answer is with unwavering resolve. That morning, a letter arrived by hand delivery. Not in a cheap white envelope or with a suspicious seal. This one came in a folder embossed with a corporate logo and a handwritten note on top. For Mrs. Lee. Your terms accepted. It was from the energy company. The real one. Not the backdoor dealers who had tried to steal her land, but a new executive brought in after the scandal. They offered a formal apology, detailed safety protocols, and signed a contract that would ensure Nora not only kept her land but profited from it under strict conditions that protected the environment and respected her boundaries. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. So she did a little of both. Later that afternoon, Big Mike showed up in a pickup coated with road dust and excitement. He brought with him a folder full of settlement paperwork and a check that, frankly, made Nora's jaw drop. It wasn't about the money, but the money sure didn't hurt. She asked him, "You really think it's over?" He rubbed his chin and replied, "Over? Not exactly. But you've already won. They just don't all know it yet." Isaac joined them not long after, carrying a basket of homemade cornbread and wearing a shirt that read, "Property of Nora's Resistance." He was still giddy from the chaos. He'd taken to calling himself her unofficial tech support, and she didn't argue. The two of them had turned a pasture into a fortress into a message, and a message into a movement. That evening, Alana came by too. Nervous at first, until Nora wrapped her in a hug and led her to the porch. Alana had quit the HOA for good and was looking into starting her own community aid group, one built on transparency and protection, not control. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked. Nora took a sip of coffee and looked out at the horizon. "Not like this. But I always knew I'd finish on my own terms. As night fell, they sat in silence, broken only by laughter, warm drinks, and the occasional bark from Scout. It wasn't a celebration with music and fireworks. It was quieter than that. Deeper. The kind of peace you only get after surviving something meant to break you. 3 days later, reporters returned, not for a scandal this time, but for a follow-up story. They asked Nora how it felt to go from being targeted by an HOA to becoming a community legend. She shrugged and said, "I didn't fight to be remembered. I fought because I was tired of being underestimated." The reporter asked about the Minefield. Nora just smiled. "The funny thing is, I never buried a single live explosive. Just noise. Lights. Illusion. They brought the fear with them. I just helped it echo." By the end of the month, the land was quiet again. No trucks. No security guards. No drones. Just the hum of cicadas, the rustle of wind through the grass, and the occasional knock from a neighbor dropping off pie or asking for advice on fencing. Nora built a new gazebo in the middle of the south pasture, right above the spot where the fake pipeline trap had scared 3 men into diving headfirst into her irrigation ditch. She painted it barn red and added a sign that read, "Peace lives here, but so does memory." She didn't forgive easily. But she wasn't angry anymore. She'd found something better. Control. Ownership. Freedom. And that made her dangerous in the best way. One last letter came in the mail weeks later, this one from Karen Wexler herself. It was handwritten, shaky, scrawled in blue ink. No return address. No apology. Just a single sentence. "You should have joined us." Nora read it once. Then twice. She held it over the fire pit and watched it curl into ash. She whispered, "You should have left me alone." Then she turned and walked back to her house, Scout trailing behind, the wind at her back and not a single shadow left over her land. Because some battles end in surrender. But hers ended in ownership.